Welcome to Mill History Talk, the podcast where we explore the past to better understand the profession of arms today. We dive into the campaigns, conflicts, issues, and commanders that have shaped military thinking across centuries, and why it all still matters. Whether you're an officer in training, a seasoned professional, a student of strategy, or simply curious about how history informs modern warfare, this space is for you. Our mission is simple: to foster insight, reflection, and critical thinking primarily through the lens of military history. Before we begin, a quick note. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the podcast writers, hosts, and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any government agency or organization. So, whether you're listening in a barracks, a lecture hall, at the gym, or in your car on the way to work, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Welcome back to Mill History Talk, where we dig into the turning points that shaped how wars were fought. I'm Brian.
And I'm Hope, your resident translator for when Brian starts sounding like he's lecturing at Oxford instead of chatting over coffee.
Fair enough. Today's episode is the second in our series on the evolution of armies. Last time, we talked about the decline of the knight and the rise of mercenaries.
Right. Knights went from headliners to backup singers, and mercenaries were the new rock stars, if slightly unreliable ones.
Exactly. Which brings us to today's big shift. Between 1600 and 1790, Europe moved from those unreliable mercenary bands to permanent, professional standing armies controlled by the state.
So, less, we fight for whoever pays us this week, and more, we fight for the crown, the king, and maybe a decent uniform allowance.
That's right. At the start of the 17th century, most armies were still mercenary-heavy. The 30 Years' War is the classic example. Commanders like Wallenstein raised huge forces, but their loyalty was to paychecks, not causes.
Which explains why if the money didn't show up, they just left. Or worse, switched sides.
Exactly. Even Frederick the Great later admitted, half his men were mercenaries and most would desert if given the chance. States needed something more reliable.
So what changed?
Several innovations. First, leaders like Maurice of Nassau in the Dutch Republic introduced systematic drill and standing regiments, proving that disciplined troops could beat larger, less organized forces. Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden followed with a national army mixing conscripts and volunteers. His victory at Breitenfeld in 1631 was a showcase of professionalism.
And across the channel?
England's new model army during the Civil War. Formed in 1645, it was uniformed, centrally controlled, and disciplined. It set the precedent for Britain's later standing army. By the late 17th century, even monarchs who hated the idea of standing armies, like Charles II, admitted they needed some permanent regiments.
So the trend is clear. Mercenaries out, professionals in. Which brings us to the big star of this era, Louis XIV.
Yeah, when Louis took power in 1661, France relied heavily on mercenaries and noble-raised regiments. Over his long reign, he built the first truly modern professional army in Europe. By the 1690s, France had over 400,000 soldiers on paper, the largest army Europe had ever seen.
That's massive. How did he pull that off?
Through money, bureaucracy, and reform. Ministers like Colbert and Louvois centralized taxation and set up supply magazines, weapons manufactories, and barracks. Louvois also standardized drill, enforced discipline with intendants, and created permanent regiments with royal or provincial identities.
So instead of Captain Jean's band of whoever he could grab, you got the Regiment du Roi, the King's Regiment.
Exactly. And Louis used patronage, titles, pensions, offices to harness noble ambition. Nobles who once raised troops for themselves now served in the king's army, often making the military their career.
That's clever. Bribe them with glory and they'll fall in line.
It worked. France's armies became disciplined, professional, and effective. Victories at battles like Fleurus and Steenkirk and Vauban's systematic sieges showed the power of this new model.
But there were problems too, right?
Yes, desertion, corruption, and enormous costs. Maintaining 300,000 men strained France's finances, but the idea of a permanent standing army had taken root.
And then Prussia barges in like, nice army, France, but let me show you how a tiny kingdom can outpunch half of Europe.
Precisely. Frederick William I, the Soldier King, doubled Prussia's army to over 80,000 men in a kingdom of just 2.5 million. That was one of the highest soldier-to-population ratios in Europe. He didn't fight many wars himself, but he obsessed over building the army, drill, discipline, and organization. His big innovation was the canton system, dividing the kingdom into districts that supplied recruits. Peasants were drafted and rotated between farm and service, so manpower stayed high without bankrupting the state.
So basically, congratulations, you're a beet farmer. Also, congratulations, you're a grenadier.
Exactly. Every village had a quota, and the state got both crops and cannon fodder. Frederick William also cut costs everywhere else. He wore plain uniforms, ate simple meals, but poured resources into soldiers. Though he did indulge his eccentricity for the Potsdam Giants, a guard regiment made up of extraordinarily tall men.
Oh yes, the king who basically invented basketball tryouts 2 centuries early. Over 6'6". Forget modeling, here's a musket.
Right, but his real legacy was stability. He created a professional culture where soldiers drilled constantly, officers were bound to service, and the army became the backbone of the state.
So he's like that gym rat who never actually competes, but leaves behind a fitness empire.
Exactly, and then his son Frederick the Great came along to put that machine into action. Frederick inherited his father's army and perfected it. Discipline under him was legendary. Desertion was punishable by death, and drilling was relentless. His infantry could march and fire with machine-like precision. But unlike many rulers, Frederick actually cared about his men. He made sure they were paid regularly, issued fresh uniforms, even stopped a march in 1757 just to hand them out and ensured they had decent food.
So, shoot deserters but keep the rest well-fed and well-dressed. Sounds like Frederick invented both HR and HR violations in one package.
That's one way to put it, but the payoff was undeniable. In the War of the Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, the Prussians stunned Europe. At Hofriedberg in 1745, their infantry advanced with perfect precision, unleashing rapid platoon volleys that shattered larger Austrian-Saxon forces. At Rossbach in 1757, just 22,000 Prussians routed more than 40,000 French and Imperial troops with a brilliant flank attack and artillery ambush. A month later at Leuthen, Frederick used the oblique order, swinging one wing into the enemy flank to crush an Austrian army nearly twice the size.
So, Prussia basically proved that size doesn't matter, at least on the battlefield.
Quality over quantity. A contemporary even said the Prussians advance as if on parade in battle. That level of cohesion only comes from years of drilling together, something mercenary armies could never match.
And meanwhile, the Austrians are like, okay, fine, we'll do our homework too.
Exactly. After early defeats, Austria reformed under Maria Theresa. Better training, more merit-based promotions. They fought the Prussians much harder at Kolin in 1757 and Kunersdorf in 1759. Russia, too, had built a massive standing army under Peter the Great. They weren't always the best trained, but their resilience at battles like Zorndorf showed they were no pushover.
So by mid-1700s, it's like everyone's trying to copy Prussia's workout routine.
Yes, their drill manuals spread everywhere. Even George Washington's army at Valley Forge trained on simplified Prussian methods. The broader effect was that wars became more cautious. Because trained soldiers were expensive and hard to replace, generals avoided reckless battles. Campaigns often focused on maneuver and sieges instead of annihilation.
So less Mad Max apocalypse, more 18th century chess tournament with cannons.
Exactly. Still brutal, but more restrained. And by the end of the 18th century, mercenaries were relegated to auxiliary roles. Britain's Hessians in the American Revolution, France's Swiss Guards. But the backbone of every major power was now the permanent professional army.
So by the end of the 1700s, mercenaries are basically side gigs, and the professional standing army has won the crown.
Right, and that shift from ad hoc mercenary bands to permanent professional forces set the template for how modern militaries are built.
Okay, but let's connect the dots. What does an 18th century Prussian drill square have to do with, say, a U.S. Marine or a NATO brigade today?
Quite a lot, actually. First, the idea that cohesion and training beat sheer numbers. Prussia proved that, and it's still true. Modern armies invest huge amounts of time in drilling, joint exercises, and interoperability because discipline and trust are force multipliers.
So whether you're loading a musket in 1757 or doing live fire exercises in 2025, the lesson is the same. Practice until it's muscle memory.
Exactly. Second, professionalization. Once states realized you needed permanent forces to win, they built bureaucracies to support them, logistics systems, standardized pay, and command structures. Today, the Pentagon, the Bundeswehr, or the IDF are direct descendants of those innovations.
And let's not forget money. Louis XIV learned the hard way, if you want 300,000 troops, you need a serious tax system. Same goes now. Modern militaries depend on state budgets, debt, and administrative muscle.
Third, limited war. In the 18th century, because professional troops were expensive, wars were often more restrained, maneuvers and sieges instead of total destruction. You see echoes today. States are cautious about risking highly trained, high-tech professional forces in large-scale wars. That's part of why proxy wars, drones, and hybrid strategies are so common.
So the DNA of today's professional militaries goes all the way back to Louis XIV's parade grounds and Frederick the Great's obsession with drill.
Yes, the uniforms, weapons, and geopolitics have changed, but the core principles, professionalization, discipline, logistics, and state control are still the foundation of modern armed forces.
Which, if you think about it, means some guy in 1750 would totally understand why we stress about supply chains and training cycles today. He'd just wonder what happened to his powdered wig.
Exactly.
So next time you see a modern battalion on exercise, remember, you're looking at the legacy of the Soldier King, Frederick the Great, and a couple of French finance ministers who figured out how to squeeze every coin from their peasants.
And that's the story, how the professional armies of the 18th century still shape the professional militaries of today.
Thanks for sticking with us through drill squares, oblique orders, and fiscal revolutions. I'm Hope.
And I'm Brian. Join us next time as we see how the French Revolution and Napoleon took this system and blew it wide open with mass conscription.